Okay, so Reconstruction. That's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, there's good old honest Abe. Okay, Reconstruction. That time period after the Civil War from 1865 to 1877, that's the general time frame that we're going to talk about. But more important than the time frame is what actually happened and what is significant about it. Because there's some very significant things that happened then. But we'll start with honest Abe here. Okay, honest Abe, Abraham Lincoln, one of the best presidents we've ever had. Was very good at speaking. Well, actually very good at writing. And his Gettysburg Address is probably one of the best political speeches ever written. And oddly enough, it was only 5 minutes long. Can you imagine today a leader giving a 5-minute speech that has as much impact as the Gettysburg Address? I mean, think about it. I think Obama's doing the right thing. He's kind of looking at Lincoln as a model for his presidency. In fact, he used the Lincoln Bible to swear in during his swearing in as president. So I think he's obviously looking at the right person. Lincoln, in his inaugural address, talked about trying to avoid the oncoming Civil War. It was pretty clear the Civil War was coming, but he wanted to appeal to us. So he asked us to appeal, to avoid war, we needed to appeal to the better angels of our nature. Okay, that's what Lincoln told us to do. Now, we didn't listen to him, but it's pretty clever nonetheless. So what do you think he meant by that? To avoid war, we needed to appeal to the better angels of our nature. What do you think Mr. Lincoln meant by that?
Just trying to find the best within ourselves.
Yeah. Look, search within you what is best about you. Search for that quiet little voice of reason, right? All of us have it, unless we're psychopaths or sociopaths or something. We have that thing that nags at us. You know, we say, I'm going to go do this. And you have this little voice that goes, you shouldn't do that. That's not nice. You shouldn't. And you all know what I'm talking about, right? Now, you don't actually have to hear voices. That's, maybe too weird. But you understand what I'm saying. There's always something, that voice of reason. So the better angels of our nature, which assumes that we have the not so good angels too. Or even totally, devils, kind of inside there trying to tell us to do things that we think are going to be great and fun and all that, and then, no, that's not so good. Okay, so we all have that dichotomy. So he's telling us to appeal to the better angels, not to give in to fear and anger and hatred, but to appeal to the better angels. And I think that's something that, very good advice for us every day, actually, to appeal to the better angels of our nature. Because all of us have them unless we're mentally ill or criminally insane. Okay. We're going to start with the definition of Reconstruction, then we'll go back to the objectives. Okay? So let's look at the definition of Reconstruction. And I like to have you guys do some of the work. So somebody read that definition for us. There's the time frame we're talking about. Can somebody read that definition for us? Yes?
Reconstruction was the process of bringing the North and the South back together after the Civil War and integrate former slaves into the mainstream of American society.
Very nicely done. Very nicely done. Now, what does that mean? So assume this is what we're trying to do. This is what we're trying to do in Reconstruction. So what does that mean? Yes?
Well, after the Civil War, there was a lot of division between the North and the South, between ideals, ways of life, a lot of stuff. So at that crucial point in time, they had to hurry up and get everything back together because it was a really vulnerable time for the United States.
Yes, and you cannot overemphasize enough the division. I mean, it was a war, and we'll talk more about the impact of that, but we were divided in two. So one of the big problems was to bring the nation back together. You can't survive like that as two entities that have been warring. You have to come back together. Now, that's just one aspect of this, right? What's the other aspect?
Now that slaves are free, I mean, since before, like, they're role in the American society was as just a worker, or not even that, as kind of just like they were less than people. So it's now like they have a newfound freedom and they're actually considered people. They're going to have to find their place in American society because like basically they gained their freedom overnight, and now they're like, well, now what do we do?
Right, exactly. That's a very astute assessment. Now what do we do? Not only what do they do, but what does everybody else do? It's clear freedom is new. I mean, it's a new thing now to the former slaves. It's clear no more slavery, right? But now what? Are these former slaves totally equal? Are they citizens? Nobody knew for sure. Now, the former slaves wanted to be, yes, I'd like to be accepted as a human being with all the dignity and privileges of a human being. But does that mean that society is going to accept them that way when they have had 250 years of slavery? It's going to be very difficult. So what I want to impress upon you is the ambitious undertaking that Reconstruction was. Reconstruction is often called radical Reconstruction. There's a reason why it was called radical Reconstruction. Radical meaning quick and complete change. That's radical. Conservative change is almost no change at all. Liberal change is kind of pretty aggressive change, but over a period of time. Radical change is immediate and all-encompassing. Okay? So very ambitious goals. Even if you just take one of them, just bringing the North and South back together, and we'll talk about the impact of the war, that alone is ambitious. Then you add to that integrating former slaves into the mainstream of American society. You're talking about twice again ambitious. So very, very ambitious. Okay, we're setting the bar very, very high for ourselves early on. This is 1865. We're trying to do this. Okay. All right. I want to impress that upon you. It's very ambitious, and that's okay. It's good to be ambitious, but you also have to understand that people generally do not like change. In general, they do not like change. Okay, so let's go back to the objectives for Reconstruction. What was Reconstruction? Well, we've kind of defined it already. Okay, we'll get more into that. Secondly, what was the impact of slavery? Okay, the suddenness of freedom coming. Well, now we have to look back and say, well, what had we done? What were we thinking? You know, what happened? What are we going to do now? Okay, the impact of slavery. What was the legal basis for Reconstruction? Any radical change, any major change in American society requires a change in our legal structure. In other words, probably some constitutional amendments, right? So the Constitution was amended. There were 3 major constitutional amendments that came out of Reconstruction, and 2 major laws passed by Congress. So 5 legal precedents were set during Reconstruction. We have to look at what those 5 are and the implications. The last is an assessment. Did Reconstruction fail? Taking into consideration how ambitious it was, did it fail? Did it succeed? Did it partially fail, partially succeed? You know, how do we assess it? How do we give it a grade or whatever? Okay? Those are the objectives for Reconstruction. Shelby Foote, I think one of my favorite Civil War writers, wrote that you cannot understand American history without understanding the Civil War. You fundamentally have to understand the Civil War in order to understand American history. Now, I don't think that's just hyperbole or exaggeration. I think that he's right. You need to understand, why did we fight the Civil War? What were the issues? What was the result? You need to understand. It's a crossroads in American history. It's a crossroads in American history. So we need to understand it. And one thing that he said that I think kind of sums up the whole Civil War period is he said that the Civil War made us an is. Now that sounds kind of weird. You know, how did it make us an is, and what does he mean by that? Well, before the Civil War, we always referred to ourselves in the plural. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, would it be like everyone referred to like, oh, you're from the South, so there was plural as in like, 2 different sides, 2 parts of a whole. Instead, like after the Civil War, people referred to each other as, oh, you're from Virginia or from Vermont, and then together you're both American.
Right, exactly. Basically, and people would refer to it that way. Before the Civil War, they would say, the United States are a nice place to live. Now that sounds weird to us, right? It sounds weird to our ears. Now it's not necessarily incorrect. It's just indicating plural or plurality, right? Now we say the United States is a nice place to live because it's one. It's a singular. The United States is singular. Well, it's really 50 states, right? And that's kind of how it was looked at. Well, not 50 states, but fewer than that during the Civil War. But like you said, they were separate, right? They were under the same Constitution, under the flag of the United States, yet they had a feeling of separation. They weren't an is yet. The Civil War made us an is. I think that's a very, very important point. That's what one of the main things the Civil War did. In addition to freeing people who had been enslaved for 250 years. Those two things, which is basically the definition that we gave for Reconstruction. So if I don't have your attention already about how important Reconstruction is, then that should have done it right there. You should understand how important this is to understand. Okay? So let's drive on here. First things first, why the Civil War? Now, does anybody know who this character is here? He's a general, but wrong side. Side of the South. Right side, but not the right general. Yeah. Stonewall Jackson. Thomas J. Jackson. Stonewall Jackson. Very colorful name, right? One of the best generals in the Civil War. Actually, the South had some of the best generals. But it was a hopeless cause. Because if you look at all the statistics, how many people lived in the North, how many people lived in the South, how many manufacturers, arms manufacturers the North had versus the South, how many soldiers the North had versus the South. It's amazing the South lasted as long as they did. Okay, the lost cause. They call it the lost cause, right? You always hear people say, well, the Vietnam War was the first war we ever lost, right? But people in the South always correct people and say, well, no, we lost the Civil War. Talking about the Southern perspective, right? So it's often forgotten in the North, us being Yankees, you know, we don't, even though we live in the Southwest, we're still Yankees, I guess. Why the Civil War? States' rights or slavery? I was in a history class in 1984 in North Carolina, taught by an old Southern white man, old Southern gentleman, very, very nice man, very nice teacher, very old school Southerner, right? He asked, in a classroom like this, he asked our class, why did we fight the Civil War? What was the Civil War fought for? And or over? What was the issue? And I said, I raised my hand, you know, real quick, because I was always one of those students. Yep, real quick. And I said, slavery, sir. You know, because I was in the Army at the time and was on base, and I called everybody sir or ma'am, you know, which is not a bad thing, actually. But slavery, sir. And he said, wrong. And I just, I was so deflated. You know, I was like, I thought I had that. I was just kind of hanging my head down like that. And some guy in the back, another Southerner, raised his hand. He said, states' rights, sir. And he goes, correct. And I thought, what in the hell is going on? You know, what does he mean by that? I didn't understand it. So then it was explained to me. It was explained to me what he was talking about. You have to go all the way back to the constitutional phase, 1780s of American history, to find out what they mean by states' rights. When they were arguing during the Constitution, they were arguing about the rights of individuals. They were afraid, especially the Southerners, the Southern colonies were afraid, Southern states were afraid, that if they had too strong of a federal government, it would impinge upon individual rights. They were so afraid that they forced the Northern states to accept 10 amendments in addition to the ratification of the Constitution. Those first 10 amendments to the Constitution are known as what? The Bill of Rights, right? Now, all of us look at the Bill of Rights and we go, wow, that's a great thing. I'm glad we have the Bill of Rights. Freedom of speech, freedom to bear arms, you know, all that kind of stuff, right? Freedom of religion. So that's a good thing. But what you might not realize is that was a compromise made to the South to preserve slavery. That doesn't sound right. It's not, wait a second, a Bill of Rights to preserve individual rights in order to preserve slavery? That doesn't even make sense. How could they justify that? Well, the Southern states refused to ratify the Constitution unless they passed those individual rights that would exclude slaves. They totally ignored the issue of slavery. Because if they would have addressed the issue of slavery, which they should have during the constitutional phase, we should have just wiped it out right then. Well, it should have never started, but let's say we should have wiped it out. Southern states said we refused to sign. So they put it up in they wrapped it up in a nice thing that looked like the Bill of Rights, and they passed it, okay? And they ignored slavery, and slavery lasted for another 80 years. We had to we all suffered through slavery, especially the slaves. We're still suffering for it, actually. Although we've come a long ways. So really it goes back to then, states' rights, federalism versus anti-federalism, how much power the central government should have as opposed to the state governments. So the argument was by this professor, he said that they were arguing over states' rights. They wanted to preserve states' rights. That's why the South seceded from the Union. They wanted to preserve, they thought the federal government was getting too strong, was imposing limitations on them, and they wanted to preserve states' rights. And there had been other crises before. During Andrew Jackson's term of presidency, they called it the nullification crisis, where the southern states said that any federal law can be nullified by state law. You can imagine what chaos that would be, right? If any law that the federal government passed, states could choose individually whether they're going to abide by it or not. It'd be chaos, right? You've got to have one central authority, and then powers have to come down from that. Well, so there had been other crises related to this: the constitutional period, the 1820s, 1830s, okay, and then the 1860s, okay, the run up to the Civil War. So that had existed for a long time. So he was right; it was about states' rights. But what was the issue that the southern states were trying to preserve states' rights for? Slavery. Right? So it's intimately connected. What were they most concerned about? Preserving slavery, because that was their whole economic system. Their whole livelihood was based on agriculture, which was based on a system of slavery. So that's what they wanted to preserve. So they made it look all nice by saying it's about states' rights, which it is technically. The states' rights to what? States' rights to preserve slavery. Okay? Leave it up to the state. They're not saying everybody has to have slavery. If you don't want slavery, fine. But don't tell us we can't have it. Okay, so individual states' rights. Now, it ignores the rights of the individuals that are enslaved, obviously, right? But that was brushed aside for reasons that we'll look at in a little bit. So he was right, and I was right. We were both right. It is about states' rights. It's about slavery. But you see, they're totally interconnected. So I've been redeemed. You know, I don't have to feel all deflated. I was right, but he was right too. So we combined to both be right. The Civil War is the worst war we've ever fought in terms of casualties. We lost nearly 700,000 Americans. That's more than every other war. Almost every other war combined. 700,000 Americans died in the Civil War. And remember, Americans were fighting Americans. We weren't fighting some foreign power. We were fighting ourselves. Sometimes families were split in two. One brother on one side, one brother on another side. A father on one side, a brother on another side. Can you imagine how horrible that would be for your family if you were in a border state and that's what was going on? So that's something that I need to impress upon you, is how horrific that war was. Cities were literally burned to the ground, especially Atlanta, Georgia. Burned to the ground. Okay? Horrible casualty rates. There were battles where there were 40,000 people killed in one day, in one battle. Horrific injuries as well. These muskets that they fired, when they hit you, they didn't go very fast, but they were very big, and they would literally rip a limb off if they hit you. It wouldn't like pass through you like modern day bullets. They're high velocity. They go right through you. And you're like, oh, can't really see anything, but you're all messed up inside, right? These muskets, they hit you, they'll rip your arm off. I mean, you can almost see them coming, you know. And then, so it's terrible. They didn't know anything about. They learned a lot about amputation, traumatic amputation. By the way, with no anesthesia, if you can imagine that. So horrific. They also learned to use morphine. And they also learned about something called morphine addiction, because that stuff's pretty good, you know. So people stayed on that stuff. So a lot of things happened. They also invented the hypodermic needle to try to deliver an anesthetic, but the delivery of the anesthetic was worse than the actual amputation, because the needle, if you can imagine one of those big spikes. You ever seen one of those spikes that people use to put in, you know, like a 16-penny nail? That's what the hypodermic needle. If somebody comes at you like that, you're going to just pass out, you know. And then they amputate anyway. So it was a horrific war. There's a misconception about the Civil War. The North did not fight the Civil War to free the slaves. Abraham Lincoln did not say that. The evidence is there. What did we call the Southerners? The nickname we gave the Southerners.
Confederates.
The Confederates, from the Confederacy or the Confederate States of America. Two separate countries, right? But there was a nickname. There's another nickname we gave them. What did we call them? I'm assuming a northern perspective. See, there's bias in history coming through right there. Okay? What did we call the Southerners? Rebels, right? You ever heard the Billy Idol song, Rebel Yell? There actually was such a thing as a rebel yell. I can't do it. I'm not going to do it for you, but there is something. There's an actual rebel yell. When they charged, it was kind of a blood-curdling kind of scream thing they would issue, and that's the rebel yell. They were called rebels, right? They wouldn't call them slave owners. Hey, you slave owner. You know, called them rebels, right? What were they rebelling against? The Union. They broke away from the Union. Lincoln said the war was a war to restore the Union. Yes? Yeah.
I couldn't quite remember what it was.
Yeah. A war to restore the Union. Now, when he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, he changed the purpose of the war from restoring the Union, just restoring the Union, to getting rid of slavery. Okay? He took it to a higher plane, a higher cause. But initially he didn't. Why didn't he do that? Because most Northerners wouldn't fight for that reason. Now, it sounds awful, it sounds terrible, but it's true. They wouldn't fight for that. They'd fight to restore the Union, to get those rebels back in line. But they're not going to fight for the rights of black people. Why? Why were most Northerners indifferent to that? We assume that they were all against slavery, but they weren't. Okay? And even those that were against slavery were not for equality. Very few people, white people in the North, were for equality among people. See, we're imposing modern-day perceptions on people of that time. We have a tendency to do that. We look back in time, oh, they must think the same way I do, or similar to the way. No, they thought differently. Everybody thought differently. So Lincoln did what was politically practical. We go to war, we're going to restore the Union. Now, he was an abolitionist. There's no doubt about that. Lincoln was an abolitionist. Now, was he a perfect, non-racist person? No. He had problems, just like a lot of people of his age, right? There's a lot of critical studies of Lincoln. And in spite of all that, I still admire Lincoln. You know, you have to look at people within the context of their times. He was pretty darn advanced. I mean, they don't call him the great emancipator for nothing, right? He did issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He did free the slaves. It became a war to end slavery at the end. So those are a couple of things about the Civil War. That we were divided in two. I mean, I can't impress upon you enough the severity of the problem. Divided in two. Confederate States of America had their own president, their own Congress, their own money, their own army, their own navy. Totally separate. Totally separate. Bringing those two back together was not going to be easy. Okay. Slavery began in the United States in the Jamestown colonies, the early English colonies, in 1619. Most slaves did not come directly from Africa. In fact, all of them came through the West Indies. Through the West Indies. They would make a voyage from Africa, from the west coast of Africa, central west coast of Africa, to the West Indies, where there was what they called seasoning going on. They'd stay there for a year or more, and then they would be sold from there, and the slave ships would then take them to the United States. So very few came directly from Africa. They came through the West Indies. But long after other countries made slavery illegal, we still had slavery. Okay, now the majority of slaves, in case you're interested, the majority of slaves from Africa ended up in Latin America. And specifically, if you look at one country, Brazil. Brazil is where by far the most African slaves went. But we did get our share. And it's horrific. I mean, you think about it, over 250 years of slavery, if you look at when it started and when it finally ended. Ending slavery would affect everything. Social customs, local and state laws, attitudes, everything was impacted. Everybody would have to change. You would have to change the way you think. The slaves themselves would have to change the way they think. Do you know it was illegal for a slave to look their slave master in the eyes? Do you know why? Yeah.
Because it would deem them equal.
Yes, because if you look somebody in the eyes, it's a sign of equality, right? You're no better than I am. I'm no better than you are. We're equals, right? It's like in the animal kingdom, right? Two dogs. What happens when two dogs come up to each other? Because we are animals after all, right? Two dogs come up to each other. What happens?
One's going to do kind of say, one's going to elevate.
Yes, unless they're already friendly and grew up together, whatever. They're going to strange dogs. They're going to come up to each other. They're going to size each other up, and one of them is going to get subservient, right? What do? They put their head down. Sometimes they roll over and they expose their belly. You always think, oh, they just want to be scratched on their belly. You know what they're doing? They're exposing their innards so they can be killed.
Oh.
So what that does is show subservience. Say, you can kill me if you want because you're the alpha dog. You know? And if you think, oh, my dog's being so cute, it's rolling over. It's just acknowledging the fact that you're the alpha dog. Because they're pack animals. That's what they do. Now, I'm not a dog owner, but I've read about this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
What happens when you're no longer the alpha dog in your house? Your dog becomes, then you're in trouble, right? Your dog has to listen to you. You have people who, their dog doesn't listen to us because you need to establish control over your dog, right? But people, even though we are animals, we're not dogs, we're not cats. We are human beings, right? But we do have those instincts, right? So if you have 250 years of socialization where you can't look somebody in the eyes because you'll be beaten, you'll be killed, you'll be hanged, lynched, or whatever, that's going to be hard to change. It's going to be hard, and it's going to be hard for the people around you to change. It's going to be hard for them to accept that, right? They're going to think you're challenging them, you're threatening them, right? All you're doing is trying to establish, hey, I'm just trying to, I'm going to straighten up, I'm going to look you in the eyes. I want to tell you that I'm equal to you. I'm not trying to be better than you, I'm just saying I'm equal to you. Well, that's going to be hard for people to accept that. People are slow to change. People are slow to change. They don't want change. They like it to stay the way it is. So if you're wondering, well, how could we even how could people accept slavery? Were all these people like sociopaths, uncaring, insensitive people? Some were, obviously. Some were sadists, But a lot of people just accepted it. People who had authority over this, they accepted it. Why did they accept it? Because of something called the process of dehumanization. Now, if you're thinking, oh, well, we don't do that anymore as human beings. We're not like that. We do it every day. There are places on earth today where people are being dehumanized. Okay? Have you ever thought about when you call somebody a name, you're dehumanizing them? You're one step closer to killing them. Did you know that? It's something to think seriously about. When you use a racial epithet, like call somebody a name, a racial name, racist name, you call them some terrible name that you know they don't like, that's degrading to them, whether it's a man or a woman or a gay person or a black person or a Hispanic person. Do you realize that you are dehumanizing them? Now, a lot of people think, well, it's funny, it's funny. But that is dehumanization, because we are desensitizing ourselves to the fact that they are our equal. That's why it's not good. That's why it's not a good thing to do, for many reasons. It's impolite, it's wrong, but also it's one step closer to killing that person. And you're thinking, oh no, I just used that name, I just mad, I was just playing around. It's dehumanization. It's one step closer to establishing the fact that that person's less than human, not worthy of life. Now, what the military does is dehumanize the enemy. You ever noticed if you've never been in the military, but you've seen war movies, don't we give names to the enemy? We don't call them, hey, you worthy opponent, I'm going to shoot you, Hey, you noble soldier over there of the other side, I'm going to kill you, right? No. You call them a name, right? Don't we have names for the enemy? Aren't those names kind of degrading? Don't you think they have names for us too? It works both ways, right? Well, that makes it easier to kill them, because you can dehumanize them. You can think of them as less than human. If you can think of them as less than human, then you don't have to think of them as having a mother and a father and maybe little kids at home that depend on maybe the fact that they're a decent human being that has helped other people, and under any other circumstances, maybe you'd be friends. You can't think about stuff like that when you're behind a trigger somewhere in a battle zone. You just see the enemy and you kill them. They don't deserve to live. Later, though, as a human being, you have to process all that stuff. That's part of what I deal with in the transition from military to civilian life. That's why it's such a difficult transition. It could happen to any of us. Any of us could be put in that situation. Okay? We are all capable of dehumanizing other human beings. Okay? And the first step towards changing that is to be aware that we're capable of it. Right? That's the first step towards changing. I'll give you a personal story. When I was in the Army, before I flew helicopters, I was a jail guard. I worked in a military prison in Germany. And we had this guard commander, a sergeant, And I was like 20 years old at the time, and this sergeant was probably 29. So to me, he was an old guy. 29 is an old guy. So a lot of you probably think 29-year-old people are old people. Anyway, so I thought he was an old guy, and so I listened to him. He's been in the Army a long time. I listened to him. But he was not a good person. He was an authority over me, and he was not a good person. Well, one day, we had to move a prisoner from one cell to another. This prisoner didn't want to go. I didn't know why he didn't want to go. He probably had a real good reason why he didn't want to go, but I didn't care. I was a guard. He didn't want to move. He was supposed to move from one cell to the other. He was making my life difficult. So I was asked to help move this guy against his will. So I said, sure. And I was one of like 3 or 4 big guys. There's 4 of us that went into the cell to get this guy. Now, I didn't question whether it was the right thing to do or not. I just did what I was told to do. To me, the guy was an asshole, frankly. That's the way I thought of it at the time. I thought, this guy doesn't want to move. He's making my life hard. I'm going to go in there and rock and roll with this guy. We're going to get this guy out of there. That's what we used to say. So what we did, we'd take a mattress, right, to equalize things a little bit. Because this guy was big. He was big. He was bigger than me, a lot bigger than me. Strong and mean and mad. He was really mad. He didn't want to come out of that cell. So the guard commander slid open the bars, the sliding bars, and we went in there with this mattress, right? And we smashed the guy up against a concrete, block wall like that. Just smashed him up against the wall as hard as we could. And then we each grabbed a limb. I had his right arm, right? Another guard had his left arm. Another guard had his left leg and right leg, right? So there's one of us on each limb. And we smashed it. We took the mattress, fell off. We smashed him down onto his back, onto the concrete. Everything's concrete, right, and steel. So you can imagine there's a lot of injuries going on, both to us and to this guy. But the whole time, it's an adrenaline rush. You don't think about, is this right? Is this wrong? This guy's just a jerk, and I'm going to put him out. So you put him down on the floor. It's really a life and death struggle, because this guy wants to kill us, right? I mean, he was mad, and he was just getting madder. Well, the idiot who was holding his left arm let go. And here I am. I got his right arm, and I'm twisting it behind his body to get him to submit, and to be quiet, because he was yelling and screaming and spitting and everything else at the same time. And I had his arm behind his back, and I was on top of him like that. Well, the guy let go of his left arm, and he comes around with his arm like this, as hard as he can, hits me right in the back of the neck. You ever been hit in the back of the neck? It hurts all up and down your spine. I mean, it's like I saw stars and almost got knocked out. And I just got more angry. This guy's just a effing whatever, So then he got control of his arm again, and then he just wouldn't settle down. So the guard commander took one of those big jail keys. You ever seen those big brass keys they use in jails? He took that key, and the guy's he was barefoot, right? He took the key and he jammed it into his foot as far as he could go. And this is not like a knife. A knife is sharp, and a jail key is dull, so it's a puncture wound, right? So immediately, I'm sorry, this is kind of gross, but immediately he starts bleeding everywhere, just bleeding out of his foot. I mean, just spurting out, right? But he passes out. He passes out. So then we just drag his limp body and then throw him into another cell. And then we did our mission. We accomplished the mission. Blood trails all the way, all the way across the cell house floor. So we had another prisoner clean it up, all the blood. Afterwards, I thought about, after I came down from the adrenaline rush of the whole thing, I came kind of down from that, and I thought, I don't like what I do. I don't like the fact that I had to do that to another human being. I started really feeling bad about the whole thing. Why did this guy not want to move? Did anybody bother to ask him? Was it some personal problem he had that day? Was it just, could he have been talked into it reasonably? Could he have been maybe, hey, I'll let you talk to your mom on the phone. Maybe your mom can talk, whatever. It's something. There was probably something that could have been done, right? He certainly didn't need to be tortured. He didn't need to have that key jammed into his foot. I mean, none of that is in the book on how to treat prisoners, right? So that guard commander went way above and beyond. But I never reported it. The guys with me never reported it. In fact, that sergeant said, if you report it, I'm going to kill you. In fact, what he said is, I'm going to bury you under this prison if you tell on me. And I didn't have the moral courage, and neither did the other 3 guys have the moral courage to stand up to this guy. This 29-year-old man who was in charge of us, who should have known better, who should not have acted like that. We had the responsibility to report it to get rid of that guy, but we didn't. He did other things, too. He tortured prisoners on a continual basis till he was finally thrown out. Somebody finally had the courage. It wasn't me to report him, but somebody did. And to this day, I feel bad about that. I feel bad that I was part of that. But it also reminds me that we're all capable of dehumanizing. These prisoners, I didn't care about them. At that point, the guy was a jerk. He was an asshole. That's all he didn't do what I wanted to do. I didn't think of him as a human being. Later, I did. To this day, I do, and I still feel bad about it. So a couple of years ago when I saw those pictures from Abu Ghraib prison, remember that? How American soldiers were treating the Iraqi prisoners. And, they were doing all those weird things to them and stuff. And people were saying, I can't believe that the military does this to the enemy. And I said, we did that to our own people. What makes you think we wouldn't do that to an enemy combatant in prison? We treat our own soldiers just as badly in prison. So I was not surprised. Now, it's only a handful of people who do that. But even so, there are people that should report it. And that's the big lesson there, is that you can't tolerate that. Even if you yourself are not doing it, you can't tolerate that kind of stuff. You have to report it. You have to get that person to change their ways. So it's possible. Any of us can dehumanize other human beings. So slavery was accepted because people accepted the fact that they're not worthy of equal treatment. Okay? It's part of our human nature. Well, what's the legal basis of Reconstruction? Remember I said we're going to look at the legal basis. How did the Constitution change? What's that? Well, you start with the 13th Amendment, 1865, prohibited slavery in the United States. But that doesn't do it all, does it? Because that doesn't address the question, well, what status do the former slaves have? Okay, they're now free, but are they equal? That wasn't addressed in the 13th Amendment. So they had to pass the 14th Amendment. Okay? I'll drop this down a little bit. Now, just as a reminder, all these lecture notes are on Blackboard, right? Some of you have those printed out already?
Yeah.
Okay. You can print all these out on Blackboard under lectures on Blackboard. Okay, the 14th Amendment, a year later, defined citizenship. So now we're saying, okay, citizens, they are now citizens, to include all persons born and naturalized in the United States. Okay, so if you're born or naturalized just means you go through the citizenship process, take a test, get the oath and all that stuff. A proportional loss of representation for any state that denied suffrage to any male citizen. Well, what does that mean? That means if you don't allow people to vote based on race, if you deny people the vote because of race or whatever, you're going to lose representation in Congress. Now, if you're a southern state that's worried about too much power in the federal government anyway, you're not going to give up that power or that seat in Congress very easily. So that's the punitive clause in the 14th Amendment. But you notice here they're only talking about men, right? We're not talking about women of any color yet. Not till 1920 were women guaranteed the vote. Not till 1920, much, much later. Okay, so right now we're only talking about men. So you'd think that would do it. Okay, they're citizens. We're going to punish the state that doesn't allow them to vote. Well, they still found loopholes. So they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Declared black people citizens and guaranteed them equal protection under the laws because they were not being afforded equal protection. Okay? So that was specified. So we're getting further refined, but people still find loopholes. People don't want to change. Remember, they'll put an awful lot of effort into not changing. They don't want to change the way they think or the way they act. So they have to pass the 15th Amendment 3 years later. That prohibited the denial of suffrage. Remember, suffrage is voting, right? Prohibited the denial of suffrage because of color, race, or previous condition of servitude. So what does that mean? Previous condition of servitude.
Whether you were a slave or not.
Yeah, whether you were a slave or not. Because what they were doing was saying, okay, fine, you can vote, but if you were a slave, you can't vote. Well, how many black people in the South were not slaves? They even had something called a grandfather clause, where they said, well, if you can prove your grandfather was not a slave, then you can vote. Well, how many people living in the South, black people living in the South, had a grandfather that wasn't a slave? Very few, right?
And even if they did, they could hardly document that.
It'd be hard to document it as well. It'd be very hard to document it. On top of that, they also had other voting requirements. If you were black, you were not allowed to vote if you could not recite the Constitution word for word. Or write it out word for word by memory. A literacy test, yeah. And most former slaves, remember, it was illegal to teach a slave to read or write. There's a reason for that. Okay, so most were illiterate. Most of the white voters were illiterate too. But they didn't give them that test. only to blacks. So
I saw one of those tests, and it was really, really confusing.
Yeah.
It was like, put a line, it was like a trick question.
Right.
Like circle the line, circle and line through the letter A. Like,
and if you get it wrong, you can't vote.
You put a line through it.
Yeah.
It was really confusing.
They did it on purpose, just to, especially someone who's maybe never been taught to read, or maybe just started reading. It's going to be very difficult to follow that type of thing. It's just it's set up for failure, right? To deny the vote. So they found loopholes around that. And if you're thinking, well, there aren't that kind of things going on about voting anymore. Every election there's problems. In the 1980s, I know for a fact, because it was reported to me by an eyewitness, in North Carolina, in a black voting district, there was a white man and a black man running for sheriff. It was a very contested election, very close election. There's a primarily black voting district. Well, right in front of the polling place, right before the polling place opened, a pickup truck pulled up with 4 white guys in it, and they proceeded to start cleaning their shotguns right in front of the polling place. Now, they didn't say anything to anybody. They didn't threaten anybody, but they had a case of beer, and they were cleaning their shotguns right in front of the polling place, primarily black voters. Now, a lot of the black voters came up, saw these guys, knew they were trouble, turned around and went the other way. They were intimidating. They were trying to intimidate. Now, they didn't intimidate everybody, but they did intimidate people. So that kind of stuff still in modern day. I mean, you hear about these voter registration things where people send out notices. It happened in the last election, the election before. They'll send out notices in certain districts and tell them you can't vote if you are behind in your payments. You can't vote if whatever, any kind of weird reason. They'll say they're targeting certain people for certain reasons that you can't vote, right? But it's all BS, right? It's just somebody trying to deny you the vote. This kind of stuff still goes on. A lot of it is racially motivated. Okay. The Civil Rights Act of 1875. Here we see the word segregation for the first time. Outlawed racial what's segregation? Separation by race or ethnicity, right? So separation by race. Outlawed racial segregation in transportation and public accommodations and prevented exclusion of blacks from jury service. Okay. So that should be pretty clear. You can't segregate by race. But we all know for a fact that segregation existed until fairly recent times. Segregation existed. In fact, it wasn't officially outlawed until 1954. So how could it exist for that long? There's a reason for that, and we're going to get into that. But basically, segregation had already come into play. They didn't need segregation during slavery. It was clear. If you're black, you had no rights. Okay? When they started segregating, it's because they knew blacks had certain rights, but they were going to, okay, well, we're going to separate you. Hey, you can have your rights, but you can have your rights in your own place. Your own part of town, or your own part of the restaurant, or your own whatever. Okay? So that's why they started doing it. Because people do not want to change. They'll do anything to avoid having to change. Yeah.
Is there any other races then? Because all these laws are against one.
It's a good question. Look at it this way. If it's okay to segregate black people, do you think it's okay to segregate Mexican people? Or anybody of any color? Sure. Because they just justify it by that. So any one person any one group that's then segregated by race is going to affect other ethnicities, other ethnic minorities as well. To a lesser degree sometimes, and depending on the person and the locality where you are. If you're here in California, they're going to be looking at, there were lots of problems with Asians being treated badly, with Mexican Americans being treated badly, so it kind of spills over onto the whole political or social arena. That's the problem with it. Yeah.
And in that case, were just African Americans just kind of poster child for this period of, I don't know, discrimination?
If you want to look at it that way, yeah. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. And they would have in South Africa, they had what they called a color bar. They would have the darker you were, the less rights you had. The lighter you were, the more you look like a white person, the more rights you had. I mean, they spelled it out during apartheid. Now, we didn't spell it out like that, but basically that's what we were doing. That's what we were doing in this country. It's awful, it's terrible, but it's if one person is denied their rights, it affects basically everybody. Okay? Especially if it's based on race or ethnicity. Okay, so That's the legal basis, right? So why didn't it take? Well, the only thing that was enforcing Reconstruction, all these laws, was the Union Army. Because when the Union Army defeated the Confederate Army, they stayed. They didn't leave. It was an army of occupation. So if you're wondering, well, how did these Southerners even listen to these laws? How did they change? Well, they didn't really change. The Union Army and the legal system the North brought down, which has a lot to do with carpetbaggers and scallywags, by the way. The Union Army enforced Reconstruction. So that was the only thing that was enforcing Reconstruction, was the fact that the Union Army was there and was not going to leave. They were an army of occupation. Now, of course, that didn't make a lot of the white Southerners happy, the fact that the Yankees were still there. So something called the Ku Klux Klan emerged. The Klan emerged because of Reconstruction, because of that radical change. Most of these hate groups are based on fear. Okay? That's their fundamental. Most hate begins with fear. People are afraid. That fear then turns into hatred. That hatred then turns into hate crime. Right? So here are a bunch of Klansmen. They don't have their faces covered, so they must be feeling pretty brave that day, marching in front of the Capitol, right? I knew Klansmen existed, but I'd never met one before until I was in the Army. I'd seen them on television. I knew what they were going on in the South during the Civil Rights Movement and all that. And I saw them on television, so I knew they existed, but I'd never met one. So to me, they weren't really real. It's like I lived in Seattle. I mean, how many Klansmen did I see in Seattle? There probably were some up there, but I never. There's nobody marching around like that there. So I figured, okay. And then I joined the Army, and I got to Germany to my unit, and we lived in barracks, 4-man barracks. And I got to my unit and went into my room, and there were 2 black guys in the room. There was 4 of us to a room. There were 2 black guys in the room. I walked in. I said, how you doing? I'm a new guy. And they said, they were really nice. They showed me around. Okay, there's your bunk. There's your locker. This is your side of the room. You can put stuff on this wall. They were really nice. I can't remember their names now, but they were very nice to me. Then they left, and then the other roommate came in, and he was this white guy from the South, right? And he was all pissed off. He seemed like just a pissed off kind of guy. His name was Red. I remember that was his name, Red. So Red came in there, and he said, hey, how you doing? My name's Red. And he said, did you meet the other 2 roommates? I said, yeah. He said, well, what'd you think? I said, they seem nice to me. He said, no, they're not nice. I said, what do you mean? They helped me out. They showed me around. No, they're not nice. We got to stick together. I said, what are you talking about? Well, we white people have to stick together. And I said, I don't understand, they seem like nice people to me. I don't know. And he said, no, you don't understand. I'm from the South. I know how to deal with black people. I said, you're a Yankee. You don't know anything about it. You don't know how to keep them in line. What is he talking about? I had no frame of reference for what he was talking about. And he said, listen. And he pulled out his wallet, and inside of his wallet he had this old beat-up card, and it was a KKK membership card. He said, you got to belong to our organization to stay safe around here. And I didn't even know they carried membership cards. I thought it was like a secret society, And I said, what, you have meetings? He said, oh yeah, we have meetings right here and this is an army post in Germany. Yeah, we have meetings right here. We have a local Clavern, We have some Germans that help us out. And I said, really? He said, yeah. And he said, you want to join? I said, no, thank you. I don't want to join. And he put his card away, and I didn't know they had cards. I thought that's kind of weird. What do they get, discounts at hotels and stuff? I don't have a AAA. I got a KKK. I get a 10% off. But at that point, I realized these people were real. These people were real. I actually met one. Luckily, he left the room before anything happened, and somebody else came in. Now, the interesting thing is that these rooms that we were in, they were not officially integrated. In fact, most people were in segregated rooms. And it was self-imposed segregation because the military had been desegregated a long time before I got in. In 1948, they got desegregated. But yet people imposed segregation on themselves, which I think that's part of the problem today. Is a lot of people, they don't realize that how you can benefit from meeting people from other ethnicities, other races, other religions. I mean, that broadens your perspective. Remember when we talked about perspective? So we do that self-imposed segregation, which I think is not healthy for us. So I was glad I was in an integrated room. I thought it was a very good experience for me. Okay. So the only thing holding together this whole thing is the Union Army, right? Well, along comes the election of 1876. We're going to look at an election here. of 1876. And in that election, Samuel J. Tilden, the Democrat, ran against Rutherford B. Hayes. Oops, I'm trying to get this on its own. Oops. Okay, the election. The election of 1876. Samuel J. Tilden ran against Rutherford B. Hayes. Okay? Now, Samuel J. Tilden got 51% of the popular vote. Rutherford B. Hayes got 48% of the popular vote. So who do you think became president? Well, wait a second. Tilden got more of the popular vote. He won the election, didn't he?
No.
Ah. You mean you can actually win the popular vote and lose the election, right?
Yes.
Okay, that happened in 2000, right? It's happened 3 times. Happened in 2000, happened in 1876, and there was one other time. I can't remember which one it was. I always forget that third one. But you can actually win the popular vote and lose the election, because we elect presidents not by popular vote, but by the Electoral College. The Electoral College is an antiquated system that was set up by our founding fathers basically because they think we're a bunch of idiots. That's the truth. We couldn't even elect our senators, our U.S. senators, prior to 1900. We finally changed that law so we can directly elect our U.S. senators. Before that, they were elected by the state legislature. Why? Because they didn't trust us. They thought we were too stupid to be trusted with that much power. Yeah?
Do you think that there would be a time where we won't need or use the Electoral College anymore?
I hope so. I hope it changes. The only benefit that I can see is for what they call the flyover states, right? The small states that have very small population, because if they only went by the popular vote, you think anybody would campaign in Wyoming? It's out of the way. It's, in the middle of nowhere. There's only 500,000 people that live there. Nobody's going to care. They're going to come to California. They're going to go to New York, Illinois, Ohio, Texas, Florida. That's it, right? So in some ways, it keeps the small states in population, the small, less populated states, in the picture. It kind of gives them more power out of proportion to their population. Yes?
Didn't Samuel win the more electoral votes?
Well, initially, but there were some disputed votes. He won 184, but he needed 185 to win. So he was short, right? And then some of those votes were disputed. Now I got to show you the rest of the story here. How did this happen? Well, what happened was that there were 4 states that had problems with their tallying of their votes. So they didn't give them, they hadn't officially given the electoral votes yet. And what is interesting about that list of 4 states there? 3 of them are southern states, right? 3 of them are southern states. And one of them is Florida, right? Do you remember the 2000 election?
Yes.
Okay, Florida had trouble with their ballots in 1876, and they still had problems in 2000. So that's kind of interesting, I think. They still don't get it right. So what happened is those southern states got together, those electors got together and approached each of the candidates. And they told them, they said, we'll give you our electoral votes and we will make you president if you do one thing for us. What do you think that one thing is? These southern states, what do you think they wanted the candidate to do?
Allowing
Slavery. Segregation.
Well, they want to ensure segregation, but how are they going to do that?
That segregation legal?
Ultimately, but just directly, how would they ensure that that would happen? There's one thing they have to do. Get those Union troops out, right? So what they said is they made him a deal. I will make you president if you take the Union troops out as soon as you're elected, as soon as you're inaugurated. So they approached Tilden. Tilden must have said no. They approached Hayes. Hayes said yes. So they made a deal. Now you're wondering, well, wait a second. You mean we choose our presidents by a secret deal? Sometimes. If it's a close election, that's what happens. Anything can happen. This is ultimate power, people. And if you think people do corrupt deals at lower levels, don't you think they do it at high levels too? You're talking about the ultimate power. Yes, it can happen at any level. And it happened in this case. I spelled commission wrong, but anyway. So they made a deal. Hayes became president, and what did Hayes do? He removed the Union troops. What happened when they removed the troops? Reconstruction ended. All that progress, done. Went back to rigid segregation. There was no equality, and we had official segregation. And it got so bad that the Supreme Court, you mentioned separate but equal, the Supreme Court took it up in 1896 in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson. And that's where they decided that segregation is okay. The segregation is okay as long as it's equal. You have separate facilities as long as they're equal. So you can have black schools, you can have white schools. And if it's okay to segregate by one race, it's okay to segregate by another. It's okay. Because as long as the facilities are equal. Well, we all know they weren't equal. The equality part never happened. The separateness happened, but not the equality part. This court case came about because of Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 black, 1/8 black, was sitting in a white train compartment and was arrested. That case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that's where the Supreme Court decided it's okay to segregate by race. In trains, in restaurants, in public facilities, in schools, as long as those accommodations are equal. Well, inherently they weren't equal. Now that lasted officially until 1954. 1954, the Supreme Court overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. So basically, in your parents' generation, most of you, if your parents are at least 54 years old, if they're baby boomers, they lived during a time of official segregation in this country. Your parents' generation lived during the time of official racial segregation in this country, where it was okay to segregate by race. And within their lifetime, and now you're grown up now, you have an African American president. Now that's pretty good progress, I think. It's not that long ago. Only 55 years ago it was okay to segregate by race. Now everybody says, oh, I'm tired of hearing about this, African American president. Think about it. That's pretty amazing. That is a big change. And it's something I think we as all Americans should be proud of, the fact that we're one step closer to equality. One step closer. I'm not saying we're all the way there, but it's certainly a big stride, right?